NASA's creation has allowed for U.S. hegemony by maintaining leadership in space race exploration and initiating technological advances useful in industry. Since 1915, the United States had an organization set up called the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, or NACA. However, the focus had mainly been on aviation research and development, leaving outer space unexplored. Mid-20th century America was faced with the Cold War between the United States and Soviet Union over deep-rooted tensions that stemmed from opposite forms of government and economic systems. Each world power desired to outperform the other in whatever way possible, and space proved to be the ground for competition. In the fight to contain communism, the United States began to shift its aerospace priorities away from aviation and towards outer space. In 1955, under President Dwight D. Eisenhower, the White House announced new plans to launch a small unmanned Earth-orbiting satellite. Only 2 years later, the USSR, America's Cold War enemy, eclipsed the US and its space program with the successful launch of the first unmanned satellite called Sputnik 1. Approximately 23 inches in diameter, 184 pounds, the world's original artificial satellite was launched and orbited the Earth in 98 minutes on October 4, 1957. International tensions skyrocketed, and the space race began as the two countries fought for international power through control of space. The U.S. Defense Department immediately approved funding for another U.S. satellite project, and the U.S. gained back some of its power with the successful launch of an unmanned satellite called Explorer 1. 6 months later, Congress passed the National Aeronautics and Space Act that created NASA on October 1, 1958, to replace NACA. The foundation of this new organization represented America's shift in focus from aviation to outer space for the purpose of a space race and Cold War victory. The formation of NASA showed the rest of the world, most importantly the Soviet Union, that the US would not allow their enemies to dominate space. The creation of such a unique organization had already proved to be a turning point in America's history, as it allowed the US to keep up with its enemy in a war without guns. With the scare that shook the United States from the sudden and successful launch of Sputnik 1, a technological gap between the two countries was a fear of much of the American public. Fear of slipping behind in technological advances allowed millions of Americans to support an increase in space spending. NASA began operations rather smoothly, assimilating into the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics and absorbing 8,000 employees, an annual budget of $100 million, and three major research laboratories. As Eisenhower's presidency came to an end, John Fitzgerald Kennedy was elected in the middle of the space race and Cold War. He made attempts towards space cooperation with the Soviet Union from the start of his presidency, stating in his inaugural address, "Let both sides seek to invoke the wonders of science instead of its terrors. Together let us explore the stars." Kennedy's proposal for NASA was initially ignored by the Soviet Union, and a Soviet cosmonaut became the first human to travel into space shortly after the inaugural address. It was not until 1962, after America had orbited the first human around the Earth, when Soviet leader Khrushchev sent Kennedy a letter discussing the possibility of cooperation in space. For the first time since the beginning of the space race, cooperation between the world's two largest enemies was occurring, centered on space program collaboration. Despite the move toward cooperation, tensions soon increased. Only a year after being elected, Kennedy made the very bold assertion that the US would have NASA astronauts on the moon in less than 10 years. At the time of Kennedy's speech and his daunting proposal, the United States had exactly 15 minutes and 22 seconds of human spaceflight experience on its record. Despite the boldness of the time frame, from 1961 to 1969, NASA worked tirelessly and the goal was met. The Apollo mission was a success. On July 16, 1969, Apollo 11 lifted off from Earth with the moon as its destination. The three astronauts on board were Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. 3 days into the spacecraft's journey, on July 20, 1969, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin descended to the lunar surface. The landing was recorded as Neil Armstrong left the first human footprint on the moon and declared, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." With only a 1.3-second delay, the world watched Neil Armstrong be the first human to step onto the moon and firmly plant the American flag on its surface. This highly symbolic action highlighted U.S. power and dominance, as it was the first time the developing hegemon beat the USSR in a highly publicized aspect of the space race. Apollo 11 was significant due to the fact that it shifted the conflict's dynamics. For the first time, many felt that the US led the space race. Putting the first humans on the moon showed that America could lead the world in outer space missions through a strong political system and highly developed technology. 6 other Apollo missions followed Apollo 11 and collected information such as data about the surface of the moon and the atmosphere of space. Each of these missions required the US development of advanced new technology that has now been developed into items used commonly in industry. An example of this is the CAT scanner, which was developed from Apollo 11 technology that scans spacecraft for aerospace flaws to ensure perfect engineering. Other significant spin-offs of NASA technology are cordless power tools and computer microchips. All of these items were extremely significant on industry and modern life, improving the US economy as domestic inventions and bolstering America's power as a leader in innovation. The creation of NASA was a turning point in America's history because it proved to the world that the US had the determination and the technological ability to compete with a country as powerful as the USSR, securing America's place as the hegemon. Without NASA's formation, the US would have most likely been crushed in the Cold War and unable to contain communism. Instead, NASA allowed for the US to eventually dominate the space race with the successful Apollo missions while strengthening America's economy and innovative image through space technology spin-offs. A Western Cold War victory that led to the fall of the USSR in 1991 would have been impossible without NASA.